I'm Elliot Chodoff, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered, your go-to podcast for in-depth analysis on the complex and dynamic conflicts shaping the Middle East, Israel, and the world. Join us as we delve into the latest developments, historical contexts, and the geopolitical forces at play. We bring you the insights you need to understand the issues that matter most. Stay informed, stay engaged, and uncover the truths behind the headlines. Hi, and welcome. It's November 14th, morning here in Israel. I'm joined once again by my good friend and colleague, Yisrael Naaman, director of the Naaman Academy. And today we're going to be talking about some of the background, important background, but the background not only to the conflict that we're facing in Gaza, Lebanon, and other places, but also the basis of a conflict that's been going on in Israel now for decades. And that is the issue of military service for the ultra-orthodox segment of the community. And here I want to start by saying that there are ultra-orthodox members of the community who serve in the IDF. They serve as voluntarily. In other words, they don't take the exemption. And here also, I think it's important to make clear, they are all obligated to appear at the induction centers when they're called. I'm talking about the initial call, in order to receive an exemption. It's not an automatic exemption, although it becomes bureaucratically automatic. And there are those who don't take it for many different reasons, and frankly, from many different sects. Chabad is the most, I think, the most. Sorry, go back. This is going to be corrected. Chabad is the most willing to serve, and members of Chabad serve regularly in the army. But there are other sects as well that have members who serve with varying degrees of ostracism from the community when they do. There is also an ultra-orthodox infantry unit called Netzach Yehuda, and there are some programs as well in the army. But, and here's the big but, as a group, overridingly, the leadership of the ultra-orthodox community opposes military service. And this has been an issue that's been going on now for quite a while, coming to a head now, particularly in the past year, once again for a variety of reasons. The war, not the least, with the IDF facing serious manpower shortages. So with that, Yisrael, the whole thing is coming to a political, social, military head. How do you see it?
Well, I see it like this. First of all, if I go back to value systems and belief, it's here that there is, by the rabbinical establishment, and as you said, there are a few exceptions, that there is a complete and utter rejection of Zionism as having been a secular nationalist movement. And I've heard people say Herzl, in other words, Herzl's name should be blotted out or obliterated, and that the whole idea of the state is what we had discussed at one point, even Shmad. This idea of serving in the military is your destruction, your elimination. And
the equivalent of the Inquisition.
Yeah, the Inquisition or worse. And there had been, throughout the past few decades, quite a few, this hope that they would join and they would become part of, and the more that you give, the more that they will feel that they're part. And I had been of the opinion that, no, this is rabbinical, this is theological, and there is also a socioeconomic factor in here that they hold on to the communities, what we've discussed as the politics of poverty, that they're dependent on the rabbinical establishment to have political parties that get the money. So all inclusive, they are not going to serve in the army, and they will not support the state. And as we see now, at the most critical juncture of the history of the state of Israel, since the War of Independence, they refused to serve. Now let's remember, in 1948, Ben-Gurion gave 400, and that was it, 400 exemptions. and got promises, ironclad promises that they were studying and that was it. And they're not just hanging out and saying that they're ultra-Orthodox. And the permits they were given, if they wanted to leave the yeshiva, were held by the head of the yeshiva, and he would not hand them out unless they needed to go to the doctor. And he said, that's my promise, and that's our agreement.
Why did Ben Gurion do it?
Okay, Ben Gurion did it for several reasons. One, despite the fact that he was a good atheist or an agnostic on bad days, as we always say, he said, look, we need to have unity within the Jewish people, and they have to be part of this, and they have to at least acknowledge, right, what we are doing. And remember, there were lots of yeshiva students who did go to war in 48, and yes, many of them ended up after the war becoming more of, let's say, national religions as opposed to ultra-Orthodox. Or even there were those who, it is said that they pretty well, just left ultra-Orthodoxy. It was also after the Holocaust, and it was an understanding that the yeshivas have to be rebuilt. But what he said is, under such an emergency, we don't have a big choice. And I just want to point out, in 77, when the Likud came to power, there were 800 deferments, and that was it. In other words, they were doing it by, they added some, but if you do proportionally, today there are, say, they're well over 100,000. Some people, I think they're exaggerating, say 200,000. This is insane. Take your scholars. I have no problem with it. The percentages agreed upon previously or add to it. 5,000, 6,000 of your greatest scholars. Put them in yeshivas. They learn. They're exempt, just like you have people who are great athletes or great academics and scholars, and they don't serve in the army. Fine. But no, not what has been done. And what they're saying, they're using the excuse that there could be a great scholar, 1 out of every 1,000. We don't know who it'll be, and therefore they all have to study. When we know it's much more cynical than that. And you have a lot of people following this rabbinic leadership, which is, I believe, leading the society in some ways, I don't want to say off a cliff, but into a very dangerous situation where there's a large group who population grows because they have many children, that is dependent on state coffers, don't serve in the army. Many don't work until they get into their 30s. And it's going to be not only a drain on the state, but they're against the state. At least that's what the rabbinical establishment of the ultra-Orthodox Haredi is pushing. And it cannot continue anymore. And we have to know that I believe there's no real compromise. There's tactics and strategy, how to bring them into general society and they can keep their way of life. But to say they are not part and that they're against the state, and they say it outright, they're against the state, and yet they're in the government. And the government says it's a right-wing government, which I laugh about. Okay? But 28% of the representatives of the coalition are against serving in the army. Okay? So, and I can get a lot more vehement than this. I'm being very nice.
Yes.
I'm being...
All right. I want to make a distinction here and maybe sharpen this. There is certainly an element of the ultra-Orthodox, and we can go to the extreme end, the group called Neturei Karta. Let's use them as our example model of that group, who are vehemently, vocally against the state, and they don't take anything from the state. I mean, there aren't many of them. Many of them live abroad, but those who live here, they don't pay taxes, but they don't. Other than the, how can I put this? The passive benefit of living here. In other words, they gain from the defense of the country and so on. They don't participate. They don't vote. They're not involved. They don't draw from the state coffers. They live on charity from abroad. And as much as I totally disagree with their outlook, and I'll say it again, totally disagree with their outlook, that it's almost an automatic, anything they say I'm against, they are consistent. The group that we're talking about, which is a much larger group, and here I'm going to partly disagree with you. I don't think they are anti-state. They are certainly not Zionist. In other words, they don't see the state as a positive Jewish expression. And we'll talk a little bit later about the religious Zionists, who are sort of a different level of that. but they don't see it as a positive expression, but they see it as there, which is why they serve, and they serve in the government. When I say serve, not in the military, but and they expect to be supported financially by the state. They see themselves as part of it, just not an integral part as the average citizen does. And of course, with them, we have a much greater issue because our idea. When I say ours, like yours, mine, and most Western thinkers think of a social contract where you take, but you also have to give, and the giving here is missing. So, what I want to raise, what I want to ask for you to break down for us is what is the great fear? You've got rabbis who are members of parliament, members of Knesset. You have parties that are led by rabbis, political parties. What is their great fear if some of their members serve in the army? Now, I understand from a personal point of view, they want to limit the numbers, but they've sort of raised the ante here. And you said it before, by raising it to a level, and I use the Inquisition as the model, saying going into the army is the same thing as a Jew being put through the Inquisition and being forced to give up his Judaism, is really raising the ante here, especially since they know that there are ultra-Orthodox who serve and who continue to be ultra-Orthodox afterwards. Again, we'll leave the religious Zionists for a moment because that's a subject in and of itself. So they also know that they're not telling the truth. And one of the things that always interests me, especially among leaders, is not whether they say something incorrect if they believe it, but when they say something they know is false and they say it publicly. So what's driving these people? You can't say that they're totally unethical because they're not. You can't say they're totally immoral because they're not. But on this subject, they seem to have gone off the deep end.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let me just relate to a couple of things you said so we can disagree a bit here and there also,
All
somewhat
right.
more. Okay, the whole thing with those who are the real anti-Zionists in the Torah and the Jerusalem faction of the
Yes.
Litvox and from what I understand, they do take money from the state or certain benefits in the hope that they will take enough that'll help collapse it. In other words, there was a policy that was implemented a while ago. There may be some that don't take anything. But at one point, you're right. And I think it went into the 90s that they wouldn't take anything. But then afterwards, they began to. And I've heard from people actually from these groups. Okay, so that's one. Not that that's so important, but they shifted a bit in the tactics. The whole thing about being representative in parliament and in legislature, we know that we had that in Poland also, what was called Vad Arba Artsot, if I remember, and the framework there of how to be involved, Agudat Yisrael, that the idea is you can be sort of in the legislature, or you can have some political involvement with, quote, the Goyim, and they also see us, certainly those of us who are not, quote, religious, even, modern Orthodox, as being Goyim, non-Jews, Gentiles, right? That's how they say Hebrew-speaking, but non-Jews, or Hebrew-speaking non-Jews. That's how you're behaving. And of course, when you speak of them not telling the truth, and what are their great fears? So we'll get into that. First of all, they're not telling the truth, but in the name of God, in the name of a greater value. Okay, and you don't have to tell the truth, right? In the name of a greater value. We can get into this very philosophically, but that's how they see it. And what's the big issue? What's their fear? Their fear, I believe, is one, there is a religious issue because I believe many of them are messianists, and they believe that by what they're doing, they will bring the Messiah through what's called the miraculous natural redemption. In other words, they live in the land of Israel. That's good because the land of Israel, as opposed to very much the state of Israel, which they may participate here and there to gain certain benefits, but they're really in the land of Israel. But they don't really have to work. They don't have to defend it. In other words, it's all a matter of spiritual redemption, and they're leading it, and that's the way it should be done. I think that's part of it, and that is, I don't know if you should call it excuse, but it's a theological underpinnings, the foundations of that they're afraid. Okay, that they will lose control of the community. And when people go to the ballot box and someone has been to the army, and has been exposed to other ideas, even if they're completely in a ultra-orthodox unit, a Haredi unit. Because after all, the military is not dealing with God, they're dealing with reality on the ground. There are lots of issues that are very logical to deal with. Plus, yes, they will run into other people, whether they like it or not. Okay, they'll keep the women far away from them because that's what they're supposed to do. But they're going to run into
Right.
others. And they will be
Yes.
open to other ideas and other perspectives on
Right.
the
They'll be
world.
exposed.
And when they come back to their communities, they could say, listen, I accept rabbinical authority in the synagogue about holidays, about Shabbat, about issues of ritual purity and marriage and all. 100%, no problem. But when I vote, because now I'm going to study and become, I don't know, an engineer, and I'm going to open a business. Listen, I have socioeconomic issues here. I also have neighbors. And you know what? I'm going to vote for XYZ party, which is not ultra-Orthodox. Many of them move over to the modern Orthodox party with national religious. But some would say, look, I can be religious and vote for a right-wing party or a left-wing party, for socioeconomic reasons, but I accept rabbinical authority. That, I believe, is what they're afraid of. They're going to lose power because modernity comes crashing in on you. You shift certain perspectives. And that was exactly, we talk about the modern Orthodox, what Rabbi Cook and others, envisioned there. They realized this is what would be. So we'll build a party around the fact that we have two forms of redemption, spiritual and physical. All right. And that, when looking at it, I think that is also what caused many of them become even more, call it reactionary, because the expectations were there. You will move towards the national religious perspective. And they realize, wait a minute, we're sort of towards the edge of an abyss now because of the necessities and also because of the success of the national religious ideals, which although they never really got more than 10% of votes in the Knesset, their ideals have become mainstream in many, many areas, and especially foreign policy and issues of what people call settlement, let's call it development in Judea and Samaria, on and on. And one could agree or disagree, but for sure it become mainstream. And these rabbis will lose much of their following and authority, especially if people embrace certain secular ideals that are socioeconomic, increase their material well-being, and say, look, you are when I deal with religion, but not when I have to vote. And I think they have a fear of their community achieving secular education and material well-being. After all, you're not going to just study engineering and not start learning something about the social frameworks or history of the state of Israel as well. You're going to be out there, okay? And that is what they're afraid of. Not everything the rabbis do and say is the only history and the only thing that's important, okay? And therefore, I think that has a part of it, and they use theological foundations in order to say, don't do anything. Because the minute you make one move, you're sliding off, it's
a slippery slope.
Slippery slope, or, I always think of it as on the roof, because that's usually where I'm sliding someplace, okay? But yeah, it's slippery slope, and that's it. So don't even move a millimeter. And that's what's happened. So they've shifted more towards the Torah Karta, I believe, and the Jerusalem faction and anybody else, Toldot Aharon, all those extremists, they've shifted towards that direction. Very unfortunate.
I think you make very good points there. And with that, I want to shift to the other group that we've been talking about, and really start with the fact that you mentioned, and that is the fear, particularly by a good part of the ultra-Orthodox establishment, as opposed to the population, of the national religious movement, which here I have to say, ideologically, I'm part of as well. Not politically, but ideologically, because politics and ideology are two different things. You know the definition of politics, right? Poly, many, ticks, small, crawling, blood-sucking creatures.
I haven't heard that one. Man, we share lots of remarks. That's a good one. Caught me off guard on that. Great.
You can use it.
I will. Don't worry. And I always give you credit.
Thank you. So anyway, so ideologically, the idea of Israel, the state of Israel, being part of a religious imperative, which is sort of a core of religious Zionism, and again, it's an ideology in general that I share. let me start by saying that the ultra-orthodox extreme view of, and in the negative, of religious Zionism is very well explained in conflict sociology, where it's shown particularly in religious but also in ideological conflict that the closer two groups are when they are in conflict, the sharper and deeper the conflict is. It seems kind of paradoxical, but that, for example, and I'll use the Israeli example, the ultra-Orthodox are less afraid of the radical left than they are of the religious Zionists, because
For
that's
sure.
where the right, so that because that's where the real ideological challenge comes from. The others they can simply dismiss. So here we have an interesting political paradox, and that is that Israel's finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, who's the leader of the National Religious Party, is actually supporting the laws to allow the ultra-Orthodox not to serve in the army. Now, I say it's a paradox because it's a political paradox that we're going to need to sort of break down here. His constituency, the National Religious Movement, is the one that is most or hardest hit physically and ideologically by the ultra-Orthodox refusal to serve. And let me just explain that before we go into it. These are the people who overwhelmingly serve in the military. They see it as an ideological as well as a national patriotic duty, religious ideological. These are people who are observant, religiously observant. I'll give you even an extreme case. I saw an interview with a woman a couple of weeks ago whose husband is the head of a yeshiva. He's a rabbi, the head of a yeshiva in the National Religious Movement. And he's a colonel in the reserves in the army. He's a chief of staff of a brigade that's serving in Lebanon. And for them to be called the equivalent of the Inquisition anti-Jewish by the ultra-Orthodox is not only a slap in the face, but it's sort of an undermining of everything that they believe by people who should be, at least I think in their view, supporting them, and they're slapping them down. Now that population, and again I use an extreme case of it, but there are many, many, many other examples. That population is being led by a political leader who's trying to do the exact opposite of that. And by the way, I saw a poll recently that if Smotrich continues to lead that party, they will have a hard time getting past the minimum to get into the Knesset.
The threshold.
In other words,
there's the 3.25% threshold.
Right. Okay. They will not get over 3% of the vote of a population that makes up, 10% of the population? Something like that.
At least.
In other words, a huge voting flight from his party for what he's doing. And that raises a question. The guy's not stupid. I certainly don't support him, but he's not stupid. And he's a politician. And as we all know, the politician's primary interest is to get elected and get reelected. What on earth is he thinking to be supporting a law that flies in the face of the will and the interests of his constituency? You're the political analyst on this. Go for it.
Okay. So a couple of things. First of all, we're comparing to the Inquisition. I'm willing to go with that. But I think probably it's more apt to compare it to the Cantonists, the Jews who were forced to serve in the Tsarist army. And of course, they had to serve a very long time. And when they came back, they knew nothing of Judaism, and they really had assimilated into Christianity. But still, calling it the Inquisition is fine with me. When we
Oh
look
no,
at
I say it that way because the word that they use, shmad, is
yeah,
from the root of to destroy. In other words, it's not just a passive floating away; it's an
it's
active
extermination.
destruction implication.
Yeah, yeah.
And
No, you're
that's
right. You're right. It just
that's
came
why I
to
use that as
mind.
the example. Right.
No, no problem. Okay, but to get to the whole issue of the question of what is with Batzalel Smotrich and those who lead the National Religious Party, who I consider to be on the very extreme right wing of national religious ideology and theology. There are a few things I think that they're looking at. One, I believe that Smotrich is less of an ideologue and more of adheres to the theology, his theological understandings. In other words, he knows that he is right. He knows that God is with him. He knows that he is bringing about a messianic end time here. We're speaking here, of course, Jewish messianic understandings. And by doing so, how does he do it? He has to do it by full settlement in the land of Israel. In other words, what we call in Hebrew, Eretz Israel Shlema, or the greater land of Israel understanding. And that overrides everything. In order to remain in a government that will do so, you have to make sure that the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi parties are satisfied. And if you are willing to make the sacrifice, okay, and it's a sacrifice of sons, daughters, okay, here in the army, and break the back of the Israeli middle class, or put them under tremendous pressure, then that's what you do, because the outcome is much more important in his belief system than the way to get there. All right. And he does not expect that he can be forced from power, because whatever he does, God is with him, or God is his co-pilot, or God's the pilot and he's the co-pilot. So this overrides everything. Now, for us, it doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense, right? You start looking at it logically. And I say, stop using Western logical, deductive reasoning when you're dealing with people who are totally theological. And I do this in whatever my analysis of certain, what I'll call extreme religious groups are. And you know that I deal much more, of course, in the Islamic direction with this, but it applies. You are convinced that God is on your side, and that's it, and you will take certain actions, even if it doesn't seem logical. The problem we have with the left and right in the country that are called secular or traditional, because most people are traditional around here, is that they're using that logic instead of stepping into the shoes of the theologians and seeing their logic. And their logic isn't wrong, because it's their way of understanding the world. It's just that the foundations of their belief system and what they're going to do and how they'll implement it is not the same. And secular people have this tendency to say, well, if they don't think like me, that can't be, because and it's hubris. So the way I think is the only way to think. Right? This is my logic, and it's the correct logic. No, there are people who think very differently, and we have to step into a shoe. So he will make that sacrifice amongst his own his own national religious population, and many of them are quite furious with him. Now, I've seen other polls saying that he will get like beyond the threshold, but it doesn't matter. He's hovering around it. That's for sure. And the other thing is he will just try to remain in power for as long as possible. In other words, could be another 2 years of this government to prove that he was right. And because it doesn't look like they could win an election right now, so you may as well just hold on to power no matter what. Mm-hmm. So I think those are the considerations. I'll give you one other one. And we're going to talk about Ben Gvir, I imagine, a bit, who's on the Otzma Yehudit party, or Jewish Power Party, which is basically religious, but further to the right. Okay, further to the right.
Frankly, he interests me less, but yes.
What's that?
I said, frankly, he interests me less.
Okay, I'll just mention him as a sideline, where Smotrich has a challenge from that he could lose and not get in, is from Ben Gvir's party, where those who are further to the right and many of them coming out of the Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, but have now become Zionist and are, call it, most extreme theologically as well as land of Israel wise, will shift over to him and pull the rug out from under Smotrich. From the other side, of course, he has your more moderate national religious who are saying everything is well and good if you want, if we will use some, call it, realpolitik logic, because we have to survive until the Messiah shows up. Because there have been lots of messianic disasters. We could start, you mentioned Shabtai Tzvi. We can, from the 1600s. Sure. I can go back to Bar Kokhba, the second rebellion against the Romans that threw us out of this place completely, as if the first one wasn't bad enough, the Jewish war.
Although it's not clear with Bar Kokhba whether it started as messianist or it became messianist. One of the things that I want to interject two things. The reason Ben-Gvir doesn't interest me that much in this context is because he is playing to his constituency. In other words, there's no paradox in his behavior.
That's
There's
true.
a lot of other stuff in his behavior, but it's not paradoxical politically. The other thing I just wanted to sort of point out in this discussion is that the fundamental base of modern Judaism doesn't promote the kind of messianic extremism, if you will, that we're talking about with Smotrich and the others. In other words, the Maimonides, who's essentially a foundational thinker of modern Judaism from 1,000 years ago, of course, certainly believing in the Messiah and the coming of the Messiah is fundamental to Judaism. But the idea that you behave in a way that you deny all of reality in order to either bring the Messiah or anticipate his imminent coming, and here I emphasize the denying of reality, not the anticipation, is not mainstream in religious Judaism. Here I'm talking about not in secular Judaism and philosophical Judaism, but full Orthodox Judaism, once again, has a Messiah component to it and a belief in the coming, but not in the idea that, oh, well, I know he's coming tomorrow, so I'm selling everything and and getting ready to go. I'm going to the airport and the plane is going to take me. I don't have to buy a ticket because Messiah is coming. Or alternatively, I'm going to burn down my community because that's what's going to bring the Messiah. Those are not mainstream Jewish thought, although they've occurred periodically in one way or another. Messiah still hasn't come.
Right. So the way I would look at it, and I see the shift, that what had been mainstream is slowly being rejected. And that's where change comes from. And I always tell people, and I teach in plenty of places, that if you want to understand what's going on, look at where the periphery, the extremists are going. And I don't care if they're left, right, center, secular, it doesn't matter. Something that's very, very extreme. In this case, we're speaking religious. Where are they going? And I think there is this semi-euphoria, and we just saw it after the elections in the States, that suddenly now we can do anything we want. And I think there's here the way Smotrich and his supporters, who are on the far right of the National Religious, they're receiving the Trump victory as now there will be an annexation of Judea Samaria, what people call the West Bank.
License to do as they please.
To do whatever they want. And that also includes certain, criminal acts by real extremists there in their behavior, not only towards our population there, but towards the army and the Jews. But and this is a certain euphoria that certainly could pick up. And we know what happens when messianists are seriously disappointed and sort of crash into a wall. They are not the only ones who pay the price. We all do. Right? And that's why I would hope that within the framework of the National Religious Party, that he will be called to order. And I'm not very optimistic. But basically what it means is it would show that he has 2% support. I think he looks at the polls much more than he listens to those who may be yelling at him. And I'm talking, apparently, I believe he will probably shut out those who don't agree with him. You know how it is. You start
that
to
I agree with you.
But you have to see public opinion polls by those who are close to him and say, look, we're down to 2%. It's not like we just need another 10,000 votes and we'll be in. So, let's shift a trifle at the last moment.
I think
So I'm worried. I'm worried. I'm worried by both phenomena, the ultra-orthodox as well as the national religious, and the fact that it bleeds off to the right, far, far right of Ben-Gvir, along with those who call it bleed out of the ultra-orthodox, become super Zionists. As much as they're hardline ultra-orthodox, they're super Zionists beyond the idea of that there should be a democracy here or equal rights and things like that. I mean, we've also had discussions that don't usually get very far with people of that perspective.
so. Here I'm going to throw an optimistic spin for our
Go
conclusion,
for it, man.
and particularly in the religious Zionist movement. I think the ultra-Orthodox issues at this point is pure political, and you know what I think of that.
Yeah, I do.
Here I'm going to say that I think that there's a silent majority that is truly silent at the moment because they are wearing uniforms and they're in Lebanon and Gaza at the moment. In other words, there's a significant religious Zionist group of leaders. We always used to joke about this, and it was the joke of truth of the division of labor in Israel, that a third of the country works, a third pays taxes, and a third does reserve duty. The problem is it's all the same third, right? Uh, so here I'm gonna narrow it. The political, I'm talking about social political, not institutional political. The social political, the community political leadership of the social leadership of the national religious movement at the moment is disproportionately serving in the reserves.
That's true, no
And
doubt.
okay, and they don't have time for this nonsense. They're busy dealing with Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah up close and personal. That's first of all. Second, and I think you can attest to this, we both got a few days of reserve duty historically under our belts. Serving in the reserves in general makes you more patriotic and more exposed to, I'm going to call it, center directional influence. In other words, you're around a lot of people who tend to be people you can interact with, people you respect, people you fight alongside of. But the majority, by definition, are more centrist. You'll always have an extremist or two, but that's what makes them extremists. And that has an overall influence. Here, I'm not talking about the individual, I'm talking about the group is generally being pulled in. And we see this in statements when people come out of reserves, and there are all sorts of centrist social movements that have been formed. I don't know how influential they are at the moment, uh, including people from the national religious movement who are saying, look, all of this extremism, all of this polarization, all of this divisiveness is simply not good for the state and therefore is not good for us. And I think that that's an impact that has to be taken into account. Now, am I predicting, victory for one side or the other? No, I'm just saying that there is a shift away from extremism as a result of the long-term and intensive reserve duty that we've seen over the past year. So I'm going to leave it at that. Well, it's a wait and see. I think we have a few other issues on our plate, namely Hezbollah, Hamas, and friends, and Iran, lurking in the background. So we'll finish with that. We'll pick up again
Okay. If I could
in the
just
future.
make one comment
But yeah,
about.
you can have the last word.
Well, okay. One comment about this issue with Smotrich. I don't believe that the more, quote, moderate, or those who, like you say, come from the reserves and they mix with others, and they know if you want to hold the country together, you have to take, a, how should we call it, a logical, realpolitik way of doing things for internal stability as much as for what you want to achieve externally.
For sure.
And that it's really good for the Jewish people. And I've heard them speak about it. It's not just, here we speak at the state, but the Jewish people worldwide. And the other thing is there needs to be, I believe they'll have to set up a different party. They will not be able to take over the National Religious Party as it is unless they do massive sign-up. And that also might force a certain change. It might not. I don't know. Okay, so this is a very significant. I tell people, you want to know what's going to happen here in the future. You really have to watch what goes on with the National Religious Party. Ben-Gvir, of course, could gain from your extreme right, but a lot could be lost by those who are more, call it connected in with the mainstream of the people. And like you said, when you go to the army, that's what you experience, and you understand this is your people. This is how they are, and if you want the place to succeed, then we have to be part of this, not fight against it. So that's certainly correct, and very good observation of how important it is.
Okay, thank you. And it gives you a sense of we're all in this together, which is part of the raison d'etre of all of this. All right, Yisrael, thanks. We're going to do this again and again and again. In the meantime,
I really appreciate it.
For those who've been listening, thanks for joining us. Stay well, stay safe, stay engaged.
Okay. Have a good.
Thank you for listening to Conflict Uncovered. As always, it's been another rough day in the Middle East. We hope you found this episode insightful and engaging. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share and recommend with your friends, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. For more in-depth analysis and exclusive content, join our community and follow us on social media. Stay tuned for our next episode as we continue to explore the critical issues shaping the Middle East and the world. Until next time, stay informed and stay safe.